And now, AM 650 presents your source for leading-edge news and information on today's hottest products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Well, welcome to Talk About Strata Experts on Call. I'm Tony Giaventu. I'm the host of the show, and on the show tonight we have Pat Williams, who is a lawyer with Clark Wilson Law Corporation in Vancouver. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Pat's also the chair of the BC Law Institute Strata Property Law Project, which is underway. Maybe you can give us a little bit of insight about the research project.
Sure. It's phase 2 of a project, and it's dealing with law reform, and more particularly the reform of the Strata Property Act. There are a number of things that we intend to deal with over the next 3 or 4 years, but so far we've spent a number of months dealing with the issue of terminating a strata corporation. At this point, terminating a strata corporation is a very, very difficult process, one that is difficult enough that typically it doesn't happen. We're now seeing an appetite with some stratas to terminate, and that means to terminate and never be a strata again, or perhaps to terminate and become a bigger strata, a smaller strata, a higher strata. So those kinds of things are what we're dealing with, and we hope to move into the 21st century with respect to the legislation regarding terminating a strata, and more particularly making it more accessible in the right circumstances.
Right. So right now, if a strata corporation wants to terminate, so they've got to the point that the age of the building is such that it's going to cost a lot for repairs and upgrades, and it needs to be basically modernized, and they're in a high density area and there's some value to terminate. If you're in a 40-unit building, what do you need out of your owners?
Well, you need a unanimous resolution, and a unanimous resolution means every owner on title of every strata lot must vote in favor of the termination, and every charge holder, every mortgage holder on every lot must also vote in favor of the termination. And if you don't get that vote, with the odd exceptions under the Act, then you're unable to terminate. Or you'd have to apply to court. So
what we're saying is it's basically impossible in most cases.
The bigger the strata, the more impossible it is.
Right.
What our study has found by way of foundation, that most of the stratas that have terminated are duplexes,
right,
or what we call bare land strata corporations. They're not the high-rise or the 4-story walk-ups that we typically see in the Lower Mainland.
Well, and if we're looking at, take a typical 2 or 3 floor walk-up that's 18 units in North Vancouver or White Rock or in New Westminster or, Burnaby, you're going to have people who've lived there for 40 years, and it's their roots, it's their home, they're going to be personally attached, and they all often have the attitude that there's only one way they're going out of there, and that's not voluntarily.
Correct, and then basically it's their neighborhood.
Right.
And they are not prepared to leave their neighborhood.
So there's some complications that come up with it, though. Unanimous vote, of course, 38 units. If you're in a 38-unit building, you essentially need 38 votes and all of the owners and all the charge holders right now.
Well, you may need more than 38 votes. If 2 owners own one lot, you're going to need both those owners. So think of a husband and wife team that are joint tenants on the title. Both the husband and the wife would have to vote in favor of the resolution for it to be unanimous.
So the husband and wife who are not necessarily living together and getting along anymore, who are joint shareholders on the unit, could be contradictory in their decisions too.
Absolutely.
So it's so modernizing the legislation in this front is actually essential to kind of help us with our communities and our community development, and it's helpful for strata corporations who get trapped. They get trapped in old buildings that have not necessarily been well maintained, that they're now having to look at other options, and they simply can't do it because of these unusual voting thresholds.
Correct.
So what's the research project recommending?
Well, the research project is recommending a few things. First of all, we have recommended that the unanimous resolution become an 80% resolution. So the threshold is lowered, and yet it's still a very high threshold. 80% in favor of something is significant. We've also recommended that rather than every vote it would be 80% of the votes of the strata lots based upon the voting schedule that's filed in the Land Title Office.
Right.
So that means there's only one vote per strata lot. It doesn't mean that you can have 2 or more votes per strata lot. So that's going to make it easier as well. That's one of the recommendations. Another recommendation is that we give notice to the charge holders without necessarily requiring their approval.
And who are typical charge holders?
Well, a charge holder under the Act is just about anybody who is registered, any entity that's registered on title. If you were to walk down the street and knock on a door and ask the owner of that house, what's a charge holder, they would probably say a mortgage.
Right.
Or maybe a lease. But under the law, a charge holder can be an easement. It can be a right of way. A lot of these older strata corporations have rights of ways. They have hydro easements. All of those charge holders, all those people who hold the easements, who hold the rights of way, the rights to pass over land for the purposes of sewer, access, whatever it happens to be, presently they all have to approve. Under the new regimen, what we would be suggesting is they would have notice, but that doesn't mean we have to get their approval. Now, once they've been given notice, they can then take whatever action they wish as far as applying to court to be heard.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stop the termination of the strata corporation taking place.
And some of those right-of-ways for things like utilities, like hydro and gas, for example, they may continue on to the new development in any case.
Absolutely.
And so what we're really talking about charge holders is they're being able to protect their interests, which may carry forward into the new developments.
Correct.
So, but what happens, we were thinking about that, we have Strata last year who actually managed to get through their liquidation process and sell their units. But going through dissolving all of the charge holder interests, it took them almost 2 years from the point to when they actually had an agreement. So, even then, the development industry can change so much that the developer may not even be interested 2 years later with that.
Well, and it's expensive as well.
Yes.
Not only is it time consuming, it's very expensive. It'd be very difficult to do it without a solicitor type lawyer who is very well versed in the Strata Property Act, because you're going to have to send notices out to all those charge holders. You're going to have an information meeting of the Strata Corporation so that all the strata lot owners understand what's happening. You've got to have a lawyer who may have to appear in court from a litigation process if somebody takes issue with the termination. Under the Strata Property Act right now, we do have a section of the Act that states that if less than 5% have said no or abstained,
Right.
you can apply to court to deem a unanimous resolution passed if it's in the best interests of the Strata Corporation.
Right. Right. And who gets to decide what the best interest of the Strata Corporation is?
Eventually the court.
A court. Right. Right. And what is the best interest? Is it economic?
Well,
is
it could be economic. It could be lifestyle. There has been one case over in North Van, the Cypress Gardens case, in which it was what we call a common law condominium. In other words, it's a condominium style, but it was before 1966 when the
Right.
Strata Titles Act came into place. And that was defeated in court.
Right.
Because there were a number of people who lived there who said, if we have to terminate this complex, we will have to move. We can no longer afford to live in North Vancouver. This is where our children go to school. This is where we went to school. This is our neighborhood. And there were a number of affidavits that were filed with the court in which people said, we oppose because of our lifestyle, and the court agreed.
Right.
And in that case, the complex was not terminated.
So it really goes back to the essence of a community too, doesn't it? Right? That this is the community these people have lived in. And you look at, many of the 35 and 40-year-old walk-ups that are around the Lower Mainland, people have lived there for 35 and 40 years. They were the original purchasers. This is their community entirely, where they shop, where they have entertainment, where their friends live. And so there's a reluctance always of a group of people who simply don't want to move.
Absolutely, and they could be there a lot longer than 35 or 40 years. The strata legislation has been in place for approximately 50 years. But a lot of the buildings are much older than that, and they've been converted from apartments into strata corporations after 1966. So there could be 2 and 3 generations that have been in that neighborhood.
Which has another issue that comes up around liquidation, because part of the conversions were a reduction of rental housing stock that was available throughout the province. And so that created some challenges for rental housing stock availability. But so, let's walk through the steps of a strata corporation actually getting an offer. So they come up to a scenario where they're at an age where the building is now going to need some major money to do some upgrades, and they're going to have to start looking at that. But somebody says, "Hey, look, we have a friend who's a developer who'd like to come and make an offer on the building." So yeah, let's talk through the steps of how a strata corporation actually acts in their own best interest that way.
Well, I think before we do that, Tony, we should probably look at whether it's the cart or the horse that's coming first. And what we're finding is in some situations, a developer will approach a strata corporation and say, we would like to redevelop this land. We will give you what we think is a good price if you terminate the strata corporation. That's one option. The other option is the strata corporation on its own has decided that it's going to terminate because it has a significant repair issue, and if they put so much money into the repair, the end value of the strata is going to be less than what it's valued prior to the repair if you add the cost of the repair to it. So just to give an example, if you've got a $300,000 building, $300,000 suite, and you have to put $100,000 into it, then that means you're looking at $400,000, except by putting the $100,000 into it, it may only be worth $325,000. So what's the value of this suite? Is it $325,000? Is it $300,000? Or is it $400,000? And the strata corporation, if they've decided by putting the money into it, they're not going to get that money out the back end, that's when they may start to look for a developer rather than a developer looking for them. The possibility a developer looking for them, it would be a 3-story walk up in a high density neighborhood. For example, around a shopping center, something,
so Metrotown.
or Metrotown, or
good example,
or near
Brentwood.
the SkyTrain.
Right.
And all of a sudden, we're seeing these very large buildings going up beside the SkyTrain route, and there may be. If you've taken the SkyTrain, just take a look out the window. You'll see all kinds of 3- and 4-story small walk-up type buildings that could quite possibly be torn down and 15-story buildings built, and a much better use of the footprint of the land. In that situation, it might be a developer looking to the strata as opposed to the strata looking for a developer.
So the developer comes to the strata and says, look, you've got a premium piece of property. We'd like to put a parcel together. We'd like to develop it. We'd like to put a high-rise on this. We're going to offer you this much. How does the strata know that what they're offering is the best deal they can get? Because if we compare it to a conventional sale of a property, I may have a private residence that's a developable piece of property now. I list it and I go to the open market for it. So how does the strata corporation have a sense that the value of what they're looking at?
Well, I think the first thing they do is the strata council has to meet and decide that they are going to look into it as part of their duties as a strata council. And I think then the strata council should take a good hard look at an appraisal. With strata corporations, they have to insure their buildings in any event.
Right.
And so they have to get appraisals every 2 years, 3 years, to ensure that what they're insuring is the replacement value of the building. So they're going to get a half decent sense of what the value is based upon that replacement value. But I think what they have to do is the council has to take matters into their own hands somewhat, and at least canvas with an appraiser the value of the building based upon best use as opposed to what the use is being put to presently.
Right.
Once they've got that appraisal, they then should be calling an information meeting of all the owners, and all the owners can then give it some thought, and there can be a dialogue amongst all the owners on the appetite, if I can use that word, to terminate. And by termination, what we mean is that it's no longer going to be a strata corporation. That means they're going to have to move.
Right, and they're selling all their units to the developer. The strata corporation, as they knew it, will be liquidated. The property be demolished, and a new development is going to go
Exactly.
up. Right.
And if somebody wants to live there again, they're going to have to buy a new unit at the market price of the new units based upon the development. Once you've and part of that information meeting should also be a discussion on how you're going to approach the charge holders. There should be a very detailed, if the owners want to proceed further, then they're going to have to put out a detailed notice to all the charge holders, letting them know what is happening. I don't think you'd want to do that notice to the charge holders until you've at least done what I'll call a straw poll vote of the owners to see whether you're close to 80%. Because if you have your information meeting and say 40% of the owners are in favor of going further with respect to termination, that suggests to me it's not going to happen. It's probably it makes no sense to go any further.
So a must-do, I think, from this, when the developer approaches a strata corporation, strata council meets, but a must-do is they need their own legal representative who is experienced with the Strata Property Act, who can understand the relationship and what's required to get through the process, but also have a sense of how to protect their interests from a negotiating power as well.
Correct.
Right? And so essential message to listeners is, very first thing out of the gate, if you're approached, Strata Council needs to sit down and have a discussion with this, but they need to retain some legal assistance to help them through the process, and as well as property appraisers to help them through the process to ensure they're getting value and that they actually understand what the implications are before they start information meetings with the owners.
Yes, and I think it's important to have those professionals independent.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is, if you've got a lawyer on council, or you've got an appraiser on council, or you might have an insurance person on council, they may know a lot about what you want to do, but knowing stratas the way I do, if one person on council is forcing this down the rest of the council members' throats, then the backlash, the optics are so terrible that you'll get nowhere.
And don't use the lawyer that the developer has provided.
No, definitely not.
We see that quite often, and whose interest are they working in? No, that's excellent. Well, we're going to take a quick break. This is Quay Pacific's Talk About Strata. At the email, if you'd like to send us an email for information, is radio@quaypacific.com, and Quay is Quay, Pacific.com. You're listening to Talk About Strata.
Delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call. And there's more still ahead on AM 650.